Hello everyone, and here are the details of today's video. Europe has taken a step it can no longer disguise with the rhetoric of solidarity or humanitarian support. When 15 EU states commit billions of euros in weapons under the SAFE program, they are not merely helping Ukraine endure another winter of war, they are redefining the European project itself. For decades, the European Union has presented its identity as a community of peace, law, and economic integration, an antidote to the catastrophes of the 20th century. Yet with SAFE, Europe drifts almost imperceptibly into a new realm, strategic militarization. The shift is subtle but unmistakable. It marks the beginning of a continental transformation. What makes SAFE so consequential is not the size of the funding. SAFE is not just a financial mechanism. It is Europe's first continent-wide experiment in building, testing, and refining advanced weapon systems directly on a live battlefield. Ukraine, in this unsettling new arrangement, becomes more than a partner in crisis. It becomes a vast laboratory, a testing ground for prototypes the EU could never trial within its own borders. AI-guided munitions, autonomous drone systems, next-generation artillery, these are no longer theoretical concepts. They are deployed, monitored, and iterated in real war. This transformation is not accidental. It reflects a quiet decision within Europe to cultivate a military identity that is distinct from NATO and independent from Washington. The European project, long anchored in the belief, SAFE reveals with brutal clarity that Europe no longer sees Ukraine merely as a neighbor in need. It sees Ukraine as a battlefield ecosystem uniquely suited for something Europe has not possessed since 1945, a space to develop and perfect its own instruments of war. This is the truth buried beneath official statements. European leaders will never publicly admit that SAFE serves as a testing arena for emerging technologies, yet every defense analyst can see the structure forming beneath the surface. The EU is not only delivering weapons, it is delivering prototypes, systems still in development, technologies unproven, designs too politically sensitive to test at home. The battlefield becomes Europe's calibration chamber, where theory meets fire, and the next chapter of European warfighting capacity is forged. This experimentation also, by building its own weapons pipeline, and by harvesting battlefield data through Ukrainian combat, Europe reduces its dependency on the United States and circumvents NATO's institutional bottlenecks. It begins assembling a military ecosystem with its own logic, its own supply chains, its own doctrine. SAFE becomes Europe's first functional military spine, a structure through which the continent learns to think, coordinate, and act like a hard power bloc. But this evolution carries a moral weight that Europe has not begun to confront. The continent's newfound strength is inseparable from Ukraine's continued suffering. The refinement of European weaponry requires the persistence of Ukrainian combat. The creation of European military autonomy depends on a war. Europe does not fight, but relentlessly studies. In choosing power, Europe begins to reshape not only Ukraine's present, but its own. What SAFE reveals most starkly is that Ukraine is no longer seen solely as a partner in crisis, a nation fighting for its sovereignty, or a victim of Russian aggression. Under the SAFE framework, Ukraine becomes something more unsettling, a battlefield ecosystem where Europe can test, refine, and accelerate the development of its next generation of weapons. The euphemisms of support and aid obscure a deeper operational truth. SAFE transforms Ukraine into a laboratory, one where the variables are real soldiers, real towns, and real consequences. This transformation is not framed as exploitation, but as necessity. European defense industries, long stagnant and fragmented, lacked the ability to innovate quickly. Peacetime constraints made experimentation slow, expensive, and politically sensitive. SAFE circumvents this. AI-guided drones, precision artillery designed to outmaneuver Russian counter-battery systems, experimental electronic warfare tools. These systems are no longer confined to simulation or controlled ranges. They are field-tested in the crucible of actual war, generating data of a kind impossible to obtain in peacetime. Every strike, every malfunction, every battlefield adjustment becomes a data point returning to Brussels. Engineers refine designs. Manufacturers adjust production. Military planners recalibrate doctrine. The loop is immediate, efficient, and brutally grounded in combat reality. It is the kind of feedback cycle major powers have historically developed only through their own wars. Europe, this is the core of SAFE's silent ambition to birth a European defense industrial revolution without European casualties, without European territory at risk, and without the political backlash that war normally generates at home. For the first time since the Second World War, Europe is not only supplying the tools of conflict, it is evolving them in real time. Yet this evolution carries a profound moral tension. Ukraine's suffering becomes, however unintentionally, the raw material of Europe's strategic innovation. Every improvement in European drones or artillery implies that Ukrainian soldiers faced superior Russian firepower long enough to provide the necessary feedback. The war must persist for the system to mature. The battlefield must remain active for Europe's weapons to be tested. This is the ethical dilemma SAFE quietly embeds inside the European project. A rising European military identity tied to a war it does not fight. Ukraine, in this equation, holds a paradoxical role. It is both empowered, receiving billions in advanced systems, and instrumentalized. Europe's future hard power capability depends on Ukraine's present battlefield conditions. This places Kyiv in a precarious position, simultaneously supported and studied, armed and analyzed, aided and utilized. And beneath this dynamic lies a deeper strategic shift. The more Europe develops experimental systems through SAFE, the more it distances itself from NATO's centralized U.S.-led doctrine. SAFE becomes Europe's controlled experiment in autonomy, a chance but autonomy achieved through another nation's devastation is fraught with danger. Europe is constructing the foundations of a new military identity, but on soil soaked with Ukrainian blood. SAFE is not simply altering Ukraine's war, it is reshaping the meaning of partnership itself, blurring the line between solidarity and self-interest, between cooperation and strategic extraction. What makes SAFE transformative is not simply the flow of weapons or the scale of financial commitment. It is the architecture the program quietly constructs inside Europe, an architecture NATO was never designed to tolerate and that Europe itself never openly debated. SAFE is not assistance, it is a structural framework, a spine upon which A new European military identity is being assembled piece by piece, shipment by shipment, battlefield by battlefield. For the first time since the treaties of Rome, Europe is building a security ecosystem independent of the United States. Weapons development, procurement systems, supply chains, and battlefield data flows are now integrated under a Brussels-centered mechanism. In essence, SAFE binds European states into a coherent military network without ever declaring itself a military alliance. It is the EU's first functioning hard power infrastructure, quiet, technocratic, and profoundly consequential. This evolution occurs not through dramatic proclamations, but through logistics contracts, industrial mobilization, and standardized weapons pipelines. These are the mundane administrative foundations upon which empires quietly rise. Europe is discovering that military unions are not born from treaties. They emerge from shared production lines, unified procurement standards, and synchronized battlefield learning cycles. With each shipment under SAFE, the EU becomes less dependent on Washington. With each new prototype tested in Ukraine, Europe refines capabilities that NATO does not control. Over time, a distinct European defense ecosystem begins to emerge. The implications are staggering. Europe, long accustomed to outsourcing its existential security to the United States, is now slowly, methodically constructing the tools that could one day allow it to act independently. Yet this transformation is unfolding far faster than the political vision required to guide it. Europe is building power without defining purpose. SAFE assumes that more weapons, more coordination, and more battlefield integration will inevitably translate into greater security. This is one of the most dangerous illusions in geopolitics. Military capability does not create stability on its own. It magnifies the consequences of political miscalculation. And Europe, caught between anxiety and ambition, risks constructing a security architecture with no moral compass, no diplomatic roadmap, and no publicly articulated limit. SAFE's momentum pushes Europe toward long-term confrontation, even as European leaders continue to speak the language of temporary crisis management. This duality, this strategic schizophrenia, cannot endure. A continent that refines weapons in Ukraine while proclaiming itself a guardian of peace eventually confronts an identity crisis. SAFE ties Europe's military maturation to the persistence of Ukraine's war. For SAFE to succeed as a military incubator, the war must continue long enough for prototypes to mature and doctrines to solidify. But for Europe to maintain its moral legitimacy, the war must end quickly through diplomacy. Europe cannot have both. SAFE is turning Europe into something new, an emerging military bloc that is not yet self-aware. A power center forming in Brussels without the constitutional debate, democratic mandate, or philosophical grounding that such power demands. To understand the full implications of SAFE, one must step inside the strategic imagination of Moscow, a mindset shaped by centuries of invasion, encirclement, and existential fear. For Russia, SAFE is not an aid package, not an industrial initiative, and certainly not a humanitarian gesture. It is the clearest indication yet that Europe has crossed a threshold from supporting Ukraine to positioning itself as an active military bloc against Russia. In the Kremlin's eyes, SAFE is not charity. It is architecture, Europe's first functioning war pipeline. Every new EU-made drone that strikes a Russian position, every prototype artillery system that outmatches Russian counter-battery fire, every electronic warfare package that disrupts Russian communications. Moscow does not see NATO, Kyiv, or fragmented European solidarity. This shift in perception alone is enough to destabilize the strategic environment to the Kremlin. SAFE resembles the early stage of something Russia has historically feared most, a Western military bloc unifying at its borders. The images are unmistakable. 15 EU states coordinating weapons, pipelines, battlefield testing cycles, industrial mobilization, and intelligence flows. This is not assistance, it is alignment. And alignment in Russian strategic culture always precedes confrontation. Thus, Russia's response will not be emotional. It will be systematic. Moscow will act along several predictable axes. First comes horizontal retaliation, the doctrine Russia turns to when direct military confrontation with the West is too risky. Cyber attacks on EU energy grids, sabotage of critical infrastructure, pressure on gas flows, political destabilization operations, all provide maximum psychological effect with minimal escalation risk. These tools allow Moscow to punish Europe without firing a missile. Second, Russia will accelerate the modernization of its own arsenal. Hypersonic systems, hardened electronic warfare networks, space-based targeting, mass drone swarms. These programs will be pushed forward as proof that Europe's awakening will be met with a technological counterpunch. SAFE's rise will provoke a Russian arms race, not of scale, but of sophistication. Third and most dangerous, Moscow may begin revising what it considers a legitimate target. If European-made weapons are degrading Russian forces, Russia may argue that the EU's logistical hubs, transport corridors, or production facilities are now part of a hostile war machine. This does not mean immediate strikes. It means the boundary around Europe's civilian infrastructure becomes porous in Russian strategic thinking. That is how escalation begins, not with an attack, but with a redefinition of what can be attacked. The broader shift is even more alarming. SAFE blurs the line between supporter and combatant. And once that line blurs in Moscow, the geopolitical map changes overnight. Ukraine ceases to be the center of the conflict. Europe becomes the emerging battlefield of a new age. In the Kremlin's view, Europe is no longer a passive observer. It is an adversary in formation, a bloc forging its identity through a war Russia considers existential. What Moscow sees is not simply Europe arming Ukraine. It sees Europe preparing, consciously or not, for a generational confrontation with Russia itself. The SAFE program is Europe's most ambitious military leap in the modern era, yet its boldness is matched by a startling absence of strategic clarity. Europe is constructing a war machine without a coherent vision for the political future it is meant to serve. In doing so, the continent risks drifting into a geopolitical identity that its citizens never openly chose, never debated, and may not fully understand. SAFE, beneath its bureaucratic surface, exposes Europe's deepest paradox. To defend its vision of peace, it is building the apparatus of war. At the heart of this paradox lies a dangerous illusion that military capacity automatically yields security. It rarely does. Military capability amplifies the consequences of miscalculation. It accelerates crises rather than preventing them. Yet SAFE proceeds as if more weapons, more coordination, and more battlefield integration will inevitably stabilize Europe. This belief ignores a fundamental truth of geopolitics. Power without purpose creates fragility, not strength. Europe today behaves like a rising military actor while still thinking like a reactive one. It frames its actions in the language of crisis management, even as it builds the infrastructure of long-term confrontation. It refines weapons through Ukrainian combat while insisting it remains a union of peace. It centralizes military logistics and procurement through Brussels while denying it seeks a military union. This duality cannot be sustained indefinitely. SAFE has set Europe on a path of transformation that outpaces its political vision. The deeper risk: supply chains must be maintained, factories must be fed, doctrines must be validated, advanced systems, once deployed, demand strategic justification. War machines have a way of shaping the politics around them. Europe, by constructing SAFE, may be binding itself to a future of confrontation, whether it intends to or not. And Moscow's reaction only sharpens this trajectory. Russia interprets SAFE not as assistance to Ukraine, but as the emergence of a European war bloc preparing for a generational struggle. If that perception hardens, every diplomatic setback, every border incident, every cyber intrusion becomes a potential trigger. A militarized Europe facing a suspicious Russia could create the most unstable security architecture the continent has seen since the Cold War. Yet the most trouble. SAFE was born from urgency, fear, and industrial opportunity, not from a democratic conversation about Europe's future. Citizens were not asked whether they wanted a militarized union. Parliaments never debated the long-term implications. The direction of Europe's identity is being forged not through diplomacy or democratic consensus, but through war-driven logistics. SAFE may prove to be the crucible in which Europe's next identity is formed. But the tragedy would be if Europe realizes too late that in its quest to defend peace abroad, it has forfeited the essence of peace at home. The continent stands at a hinge point. It can emerge as a force for diplomatic renewal, or it can march quietly, unknowingly, into the architecture of permanent militarization. The question that now defines Europe's destiny is not whether SAFE will succeed. It is whether Europe will remain in control of what SAFE is turning it into.